So this is Acts chapter 21, the scripture for June 15th. Now, if you imagine the Acts of the Apostles as a TV show, then chapter 21 is when the show kind of begins its final arc toward the season or series finale. Beginning in this chapter, there are cliffhangers, legal proceedings, passionate speeches. It's masterfully written. And you'd be forgiven if you just sat down and read through the whole thing in one sitting. It's that captivating, I think. At the beginning of this chapter, there's some slight foreboding that had ended the last chapter of Paul's going to Jerusalem. And at the beginning of this chapter, we see a little bit more why, what Jerusalem has in store for Paul. And the slight foreboding becomes more a word of warning, maybe even urgent panic. The disciples in Tyre, Paul's sailed through the Mediterranean at this point and has landed in Tyre, and the disciples there warn him. A prophet named Agabus comes to him and warns him and ties up his hands and his waist, saying, such will be done to Paul, or if you go down to Jerusalem. But Paul is dead set on going in spite of these warnings. While Scripture is silent on this, I tend to think of Paul as a pretty stubborn person when he feels called to do something. I think that other people may kind of get that impression from Paul as well. So Philip, who we last heard about back when he was preaching to the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, he had been ordained in Acts 6 as one of the 7 deacons. And so when it says Philip the evangelist, one of the 7, it's referring to the scripture is referring to the 7 deacons ordained in Acts 6. So he settled in Caesarea with his 4 daughters. And now, because the last time we saw Philip was in Acts 8, and he was kind of going up to Caesarea after he spoke with the Ethiopian eunuch, maybe he had been traveling that whole time with his 4 daughters. Or maybe he just ended up kind of settling there and invited his family to come join him. We're not sure. But what we do see is that Philip has been called and perhaps ordained to a new role, that of evangelist. And while deacons and evangelists can, of course, overlap, the idea that he was known not only as one of the 7, but as Philip the evangelist, that may testify to the good work that he did in Samaria back in Acts 8, along with the Ethiopian eunuch, and all the way kind of up to Caesarea. So Paul gets to Jerusalem, and immediately he reports to the Jerusalem elders and to James, who was the head of the Jerusalem church at the time, and the same James as in Acts 15, possibly Jesus' brother. And there are some hints that perhaps all is not well here. There are some hints that perhaps some of what Paul had been doing, rumors had come back about it to the Jerusalem church, and those rumors may not have been fully true. It's divulged that Paul's missionary work with the Gentiles and the stories about that have taken on a life of their own. And so the church, although it repeats the same laws as were given in Acts 15, the church thinks that it would be best for Paul to undergo a rite of purification, basically to demonstrate to anybody watching, hey, I value the law. I feel Jewish myself, and I would never suggest that people completely desert the law. So Paul does this. One of the chief ideas that Paul has is that more than anything else, by any means necessary, he wants to make sure that the gospel is preached. And if this is going to get people to understand the good news of Jesus Christ, so be it, I'll do it. So the problem, though, is that this holds Paul in a single place, and the Jews end up taking him captive. He has to stay in the temple for 7 days. Now, it was a capital offense at that time to bring a non-Jew into the temple with you. The temple courts outside of the court of the Gentiles were only accessible for those who were Jewish. And it was thought that Paul had brought one of his traveling companions, mentioned back in Acts 20, verse 4, with him. So upon hearing of the uproar that this assumption causes and how many people in Jerusalem now want to see Paul done in and killed and taken away, the tribune of the Roman cohort comes and basically is like, hey, what's going on here? And he takes Paul in for questioning. Now, a tribune is the commander of 1,000 men. That's what a cohort is. And at this time, this tribune was suspicious that Paul was this Egyptian pseudo-Messiah that had control of about 30,000 men who was trying to, quote-unquote, liberate Jerusalem. You can read more about this if you want to read some of Josephus, a Jewish historian of the time. The tribune had assumed that Paul was this character, but Paul, in speaking Greek to him, tells him, no, that's not who I am. Here's who I am. And hey, may I speak to the crowd? At this point, the chapter ends. And if you'd like to read on and see what Paul has to say, of course you're welcome to. But I wonder, when have you assumed something that hurts someone else? That's all for Acts chapter 21. Tomorrow, on the 16th of June, we'll be looking at Acts chapter 22. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.